We've studied pretty hard what walking is like during kinesiology, but today we're going to think about how running, hopping, and jumping are different than walking. So walking is, as we've talked about before, a type of locomotion that depends a lot upon passive sources of energy. A very esteemed scientist, McNeill Alexander, defined walking as controlled falling over the stance limb, and therefore the speed of walking, the vertical acceleration, cannot exceed that of quitting. So why is it that we go from walking to running at the speed that we do? If we were to just think about the physics behind it, we would be able to calculate that number based upon something called the Froude ratio, which is that the velocity squared over leg length times the acceleration of gravity. And there we see the quantities. And so the theoretical max of the Froude ratio is 1. So theoretically, the top speed of walking is the square root of a person's leg length times the acceleration of gravity. However, what we tend to see with people is that they break into running from walking at about half that speed. So, with all respect to Sir Isaac Newton, the transition from walking to running is based upon something other than Newtonian mechanics. So if it isn't Newtonian mechanics that dictate the transition speed of walking into running, what is it? Is it decreasing energy consumption? Well, actually not, because energy consumption actually increases as we go from walking to running. Of course, velocity also increases. Is it because of anthropometric variables? There is some evidence of this. There's a significant correlation between the maximum walking speed and standing height, leg length, shank length, and the muscle strength. However, the most important reason that we transition from walking into running at the speed that we do has to do with the strategy for energy preservation. Now, walking, as we've talked about before, preserves energy through preservation of momentum. However, running takes advantage of elastic energy return. However, as we've also been discussing over the past couple of weeks, in order to have elastic energy return, you have to have loading at a certain velocity. And sports, with perhaps the exception of powerlifting, all involve velocity. So in this case, specifically, it takes advantage of the stiffness of the leg springs, which increase with velocity. In order to illustrate how important elastic energy return is in the energy preservation, let's think about the example of what is called pose running. Pose running was an idea of allegedly improving running economy that was proposed by a Russian physiologist named Nicholas Romanov, and it was popular about 10 years ago. It's still being taught in some places, but the idea is that by minimizing the vertical excursion of the center of gravity during running, that you can also maximize running economy. With training and practice, people who are able to minimize the vertical excursion of the center of mass during running. However, what the data show is that this actually somewhat increases the energy cost of crossing distance. And the reason for that is that in order to minimize that vertical excursion, the runners are somewhat damping the energy rather than storing it and returning it for the running. So where does that elastic energy come from? It is a function of both neuromuscular control and connective tissue, to the extent that they actually can't be parsed out from each other. So as evidence of the contribution of neuromuscular control, in maximal speed running, the recruitment of certain muscles can actually exceed that of maximal voluntary contraction. The properties of connective tissue in elastic energy return are things that we've talked about before, that the stiffness is dependent upon the rate of loading. But biomechanical studies have estimated that up to 50% of the energy of propulsion returned from the stance leg is due to elastic energy storage in the Achilles tendon, extrinsic plantar flexor tendons of the foot, and the plantar fascia. There are some other ways in which this different strategy between walking and running manifest. For example, if we look at ground reaction forces during the stance phase, in walking we start with initial contact. And with initial contact, there is, of course, the support force, which is coming up from the ground, but there's also a braking force, which is going from the ground into the foot of the person who's making contact with the ground. And then in the middle, there is a support phase exclusively, where the ground reaction force is going straight up into the person through the foot, and then there's a propulsive phase, in which case the person is pushing off, and the ground reaction force is now propelling the person forward from the stance phase. You can further see manifestations of this effect if you look at ground reaction force profiles in walking, running, and sprinting. Over to your left all the way is a ground reaction force profile in walking. On the right is sprinting. On each of these diagrams, the vertical axis is the magnitude of the force, and the horizontal axis is the passage of time from initial contact to toe off. For walking, the ground reaction force profile is bimodal. That is that the braking force is about equal to the propulsive force, and this makes sense for what we remember about walking, that it's a form of locomotion that is designed to maximize distance crossed per energy usage, so that the inertia has to balance itself out. We're not constantly speeding up and slowing down. That would be energy inefficient. However, remember that in running, the energy strategy shifts from preservation of momentum to taking advantage of elastic energy return. So what you see in the ground reaction force profile during running is, with most people, a little bit of an impact peak. That's all the way to the left of the profile. I'll show you here, right here. And then a much bigger propulsive peak. People who are forefoot strikers, for a variety of reasons, usually don't have an impact peak at all. And then finally, in sprinting is exclusively a forefoot strike. So what you see is that there is no braking force measurable at all, that you have exclusively impact force. And if you look at, you can see this effect if you look at the composite ground reaction forces in walking, running, and sprinting. In walking, if you add up all the ground reaction forces, then in the summation, they're pointing upward or straight into the body of the person running, because the braking and propulsive forces cancel each other out. In running, you have more propulsive forces than you have braking forces, so you begin to get a bias toward propulsive, and in sprinting, even more so. We have the same muscles, whether we're walking or running, so the order of muscular recruitment is really similar in order to stabilize the pelvis and trunk on the thigh. So at foot contact, you have an external ground reaction force, which includes a braking force, so it's pushing the pelvis into anterior pelvic tilt. However, we have muscular forces coming from the trunk that are counteracting that force. During mid-stance, the forces are mainly in the frontal plane. So we have the high external hip adduction force coming from the Hattel weight, as you see illustrated in this yellow arrow. And we also have a ground reaction force coming up on the other side of the hip joint axis. So that must be stabilized mainly by the muscular forces of the hip abductors. During the propulsive phase, the forces are coming in the opposite direction than they were compared to initial contact. So we have a ground reaction force coming up from posterior on the underside of the sagittal plane axis of the hip joint, which would cause posterior pelvic tilt. So that needs to be canceled out or controlled by a muscular force causing anterior pelvic tilt from the back extensors. Now, remember that the main difference between walking and running, so far as the actual kinematics, is that during walking, the foot strike and single limb stance alternate. In running, those events are simultaneous. Now, here is a bit more of a detailed description of what goes on in walking. Remember that the peak of trunk muscle activity is at foot strike and toe off. And foot strike on one side is taking place about the same time as toe off on the opposite side. So you have both abdominal and back extensor recruitment during that phase in walking, although neither are actually very high. The trunk muscles are not active during single limb support because, remember, that the high compressive forces that are caused by muscles are really healthy for the joints as long as they're being applied cyclically. And if they were active during single limb support, then it would not be cyclical. So this is probably the main reason that single limb support is mainly supported by the hip abductor muscles without the trunk muscles on the opposite side contributing very much. Okay, so the punchline is that the peak muscle activity varies between the trunk, which is during initial contact and loading, or in other words, double limb stance, and the hip, which is mainly active during single limb stance. So in walking, the strategy that we have to ensure cyclic loading is alternation between the main trunk muscle recruitment and the main hip muscle recruitment. However, in running, we still have cyclic loading, but through a different strategy. Foot strike and single limb support are simultaneous, so it's different than walking in that way, and therefore you have a big spike in muscular activity and joint compressive force during foot strike and single limb support, so mainly just called the foot strike. And then we have a flight phase or a float phase when neither the hip nor the trunk are really active so far as muscular recruitment. So you still have that alternation, but instead of alternating between hip muscles and trunk muscles, you have all those muscles attaching to the pelvis very active during the stance phase, and then all the activity of those muscles really decreasing significantly during the flight phase. So you still have cyclic loading, but through a different strategy compared to walking. In addition to the differences in the order of muscular recruitment, we can see some really interesting differences in the way running uses the spring behavior of the joints. And again, this makes sense based upon what we were discussing a little earlier, that running is a strategy of movement that really depends upon elastic energy return for energy preservation. So the ankle joint stiffness increases slightly from walking to running. That doesn't mean that there isn't more angular displacement of the ankle. Just remember that you need more torque in order to displace that spring if it's the same amount of stiffness. The hip increases steadily, so it increases linearly as speed increases. However, what happens at the knee is really interesting. So what happens at the knee when we transition from walking to running is especially interesting, and we really depend upon the stiffening of the knee spring to provide us elastic energy in running. So we have the co-contraction of the vasti and the hamstrings, which increases the knee spring stiffness to 3 times what it is in walking. The knee being flexed throughout weight bearing allows increased elastic energy return, such as we see here. Now, it's not surprising that the recruitment of the quadriceps should be so much greater than it is in walking, because the quadriceps is a very big and very energy intensive muscle to use. Other variables include the knee angle at foot contact. As we were just describing, the knee is flexed throughout contact in running, but is close to fully extended during walking. So far, we've just been talking about the energy coming from the stance leg. And the stance leg is an important source of energy in walking and running, but it is not the only one, nor even really the most important one. And we're going to talk about that over the next couple minutes. So the sources of propulsion in walking or running are, first of all, the inertia of the torso. This is really important, especially in walking. The forward kinetic energy of the swinging leg. And this is actually the biggest source of propulsive energy, and even more so in running and even more so in sprinting than it is in walking. And this is why the hamstring muscles are so important. The hamstring muscles are the only muscle group that have much higher recruitment during swing than they do during stance. And then finally, the ground reaction force from the stance. So what this link is, and I want you to go ahead and open this up, it's Usain Bolt from a few years ago. And Usain Bolt, like some other athletes, was so much better than his peers that he appeared to be a completely different species. Anyway, if you look at his start, he is not a great starter. And then also a really interesting thing about the start, and this is almost always true in sprinting, is that people are inclined forward during the start of the sprint. A lot of people think that people are inclined forward during sprinting for the whole sprint, but that's actually not true. So if you look at this link at about 10 meters, they're still inclined forward, so they're still really depending upon the driving force of their stance limbs for acceleration. But once they pass 10 meters, all the sprinters become upright, and this is when Usain Bolt is really able to depend upon those long legs, and he must have amazingly powerful hamstrings to link that kinetic energy of the swinging limb back to the trunk to bring him forward. And he depends upon these long legs while upright to really provide him with the speed. The energetics of running versus hopping or jumping, at least double-legged hopping or jumping, are more similar than you'd probably expect. Because both employ the spring mechanism of energy return. One of the main differences is that there's minimal frontal plane external moments because you have ground reaction force coming from both sides, and the reason hopping across the floor is so much slower than running across the floor is because there is no momentum of the swing leg to assist with propulsion. Okay, and you can just look at the summary ideas on your